adjustment of the setting. You've got those American flags set up. Perhaps he's trying to look presidential again. You may see a show of force. We saw that increasingly in the courthouse, whether it was his children. You had Tiffany Trump, in fact, showing up toward the end, who is not someone we typically see next to Donald Trump's side, as well as elected Republicans from the House Freedom Caucus all the way up to House Speaker Mike Johnson. Perhaps we'll see some of that as well. And I think that we will, as we did yesterday, he sounded angry, and Katrina can speak about this more specifically because she looked at him as he was exiting the room. But I could tell from his voice yesterday that he was frustrated. His lawyer, Todd Blanche, appeared on network television last night saying that they did perhaps expect a hung jury at the very least. And it may have come as a surprise to him that with only roughly 10 to 11 hours of deliberation, this jury of 11 New Yorkers decided unanimously that he was guilty. And we should remind ourselves what that means. That means that they found that not only he falsified those checks to Michael Cohen, but that he did so while pursuing an election through unlawful means. So these jurors decided it's a felony because he was paying off people to suppress stories that he didn't want the American public to see. Right now, we expect Trump to change the narrative, complain about the judge, complain about the jury and the process, and tell the supporters he has and those on the fence that now they need to head to the polls in November to put him back into the White House.
I think that's an interesting observation, though, like the imagery, right? The difference in the backdrop. I mean, you remember when he announced that he was running for president, right? He descended down that escalator, the golden escalator, and there was he went from a reality star to a potential president, a presidential candidate. And so you can see him trying to perhaps get back that glitter of that moment. You know what I mean?
What will be different this time around, and we should let our audience know, is when he steps to that podium, we will not take his remarks live, unlike that last time back in 2016 when it was a novelty. Today, we know that if it's going to be a litany of grievances that he's been making since the election, and now in the wake of this verdict, that he is going to attack the jury, he's going to attack the judge. We won't take those comments, but if he does take questions from members of the press, or if he does make news, whatever that is deemed to be, we might share some of that with the viewers here at CBS News.
Katrina, can I ask you something? Because he talked about, you know, the potential for him to be attacking the judge or the jury. Is the gag order still in place?
This is a very interesting question because Todd Blanche said last night that they are still under the gag order. But normally a gag order ends when the trial ends. Once the verdict comes in, the gag order should lift. It seems like either something different is happening in this case or they're claiming the gag order is still in place. Either way, it's still really not in his best interest to be making that kind of commentary because the sentencing is coming up and all of these things can be factors in the judge's sentence. So if Trump suddenly goes around and starts attacking all of the witnesses or the jury for that matter, which Judge Merchan has a lot of respect for these jurors, for the people who took many weeks out of their life to sit through that trial. And I can't even imagine what a big decision that was. They know that they're putting a former and possibly future president into the position of becoming a convicted felon as he's running for office. So whatever the case is, it's really not in Trump's best interest to be making those kind of remarks, and they could lead to a harsher sentence for him.
Can I ask you, Katrina, about taking us to that moment when the judge indicated to the packed courtroom that the jury had, in fact, reached a verdict? Because there was reporting from many outlets, including our own, that Donald Trump seemed to sort of be in good spirits at a later point in the day. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he seemed to be in good spirits. What happened then?
It was such a strange moment because, as you said, the judge had actually told us that we were all done for the day. Trump was smiling. He was talking with his attorney, Todd Blanche. The reporters were all getting ready to go home. And then suddenly the judge came back in, said the jury had a verdict, and the whole tone shifted. Everything went still. There was just this like incredible feeling of tension in the air. And then the judge brought the jury in. They read those guilty verdicts. I think it was just a couple of minutes and all 34 counts were found guilty. And Trump just sat there very surprisingly contained. He didn't have a lot of expression. It almost seemed as though his eyes were closed for part of the time, which was a normal posture for him during this trial, but was surprising when this verdict was coming down. And
So
then,
there you see the former president there. Again, as I say, we are going to monitor his remarks, and if he makes some news or he starts to take questions from members of the press, we'll bring that live. But Katrina, the juries, and you and Errol pointed this out, the fact that a lot of people today who are Trump supporters, and including the former president himself, are suggesting that the entire legal system is rigged because of this trial. The jurors were selected by not just the prosecutors. Talk to us about the process by which even Trump's lawyers said, yes, this juror should sit on this jury because we feel that they're impartial.
I mean, the jury selection process took a week. They went through over 100 jurors, and each side is able to get rid of certain jurors during that process. They have both, I think, 10 people they don't have to have a really strong reason that they want to get rid of, and then they can also have for-cause challenges. I think there were a couple jurors that Trump's team was not happy with that did end up on this jury, but the judge listened to their case on those people, and he thought that they were going to be impartial. And I really do think that this jury took their job extremely seriously. Hearing them during jury selection and then just observing them during the trial, you have the sense that they really were trying to hear out this case. They were paying such close attention to every witness, to every moment of this trial. And I didn't really view them as looking as though they were biased, although you obviously don't know what's going on in someone's head.
Well, that's the nature of compromise. I mean, you can't strike every single potential juror that you don't like, or else it would just go on forever. You'd never pick a jury, right? So you get a set amount. You can strike a certain amount. Both sides get their chance, and you get what you get.
Oh, and let's not forget one of the jurors.
I was about to mention
because there was the survey of where these jurors got their news from. There was at least one juror.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Who said that they got most of their news from Truth Social,
which is
Donald
company.
Trump's social media platform that's very pro-Trump. Now, this person said they pay attention to all the outlets as well, but that's something that they really do trust and pay attention to. And both sides, to Katrina's point, because you only get so many strikes, agreed to these 12 jurors and the alternates to be the ones who would ultimately decide Donald Trump's guilt or innocence. And another point is that each of the 34 counts were effectively based on 11 different instances. It was 11 checks, 11 invoices, and the corresponding vouchers. So you really only needed to convince the jury of one simple narrative, that Donald Trump falsified the record and did so pursuing an election through unlawful means. And because of the jury instructions that they requested and the testimony they requested, all of that sidestepped Michael Cohen, who had the most credibility issues. So that gives us the sense that on day one, during those first 4 hours, most perhaps of the jury was already convinced of Donald Trump's guilt, except for those who were on the fence, likely, we don't know for sure, because of Michael Cohen. And that's why they needed the additional instructions from the judge on what does it mean to be an accomplice and how should we value that testimony? And what does an inference mean? How can we make an inference if we don't have the direct evidence in front of us? And that's all it took the following morning, once they had that all read back to them, to get all 12 of them to believe in Donald Trump's guilt. And that includes someone who gets most of their news from Truth Social.
Right, because you've heard sort of critics say, 34 counts, they barely spent any time deliberating. But if
what does that mean? I don't understand that. Why are people, because some juries come back quickly and some don't. I don't know I don't understand what another case that has nothing to do with what we're talking about now, that may be more complicated, that somebody would say, well, they spent 2 weeks deciding that and they only did.
I think people think you look at count one, count two, count three, count four. But if they're all basically the same.
That's what I was going to say.
Then it's pretty. If you find him guilty of the first five, chances are you're going to find him guilty of the other ones.
Errol and Katrina, what did the judge say to the jury in the instructions, the analogy he made about rain?
I thought that was a very interesting analogy. So he said, if you wake up in the morning and you see that it's wet outside on the ground, you see people carrying umbrellas, you see raincoats, you can reasonably infer that it rained. And so as long as you're using reasonable rationale, you can infer that something happened. And that's very crucial to this case, where there's not a lot of direct evidence outside of Michael Cohen's testimony saying that Trump knew about all of these things. But when you look at all of the pieces of this case together, it just becomes a very clear-cut narrative that he was very likely involved in this scheme. So the concept of inference, I think, was crucial for the jury to understand, particularly to make sure that they felt Trump was properly tied in terms of intent for these charges.
So we have been listening to Donald Trump speaking, just to let people know. He's actually not saying anything new thus far. It's a lot of what we have been hearing from him as he's been leaving the courtroom, talking about the gag order and other things. So once again, if he says something that is newsworthy, we will definitely let you know and we will dip into it. Errol, let me ask you about his attorney, Todd Blanche. What has he been saying about the outcome of this case?
He's been already doing press.
Just last evening, he was on a news network discussing his reaction to all of this, and he was pressed on the idea that he was perhaps expecting a hung jury or a split jury. And he said that, in some ways they were expecting that, but they were, convinced of Donald Trump's innocence. I think the thing that we've all noticed covering Trump for such a long time is that any of his lawyers, to their credit or not, usually have an audience of one, and that's Donald Trump. And that means discrediting anyone who has a separate opinion, whether or not you're within or outside of the legal bounds. And most of the lawyers who've shown up for him in court have proven an ability to do that. One of Todd Blanche's problems, though, is he was admonished by Judge Merchant multiple times for going outside of those bounds, most recently for saying during his closing arguments that you shouldn't send this man to prison just because of Cohen's testimony or the evidence. Now, a prison sentence is not necessarily something that comes along with a guilty conviction in this case. And so the judge had to clarify to the jury, that struck for the record, don't consider that. He may be found guilty and not serve prison time. But on network television last night, he was defending Trump and defending the checks. Still, another issue I see with Donald Trump making what he hopes is a presidential kind of statement at Trump Tower. This was the nexus of the scheme. This was the location in 2015, perhaps before he came down or after he came down the escalators famously, where he met with Cohen and Pecker to concoct a way to mislead American voters by suppressing alleged negative stories. Yeah. I don't think 2024 is the same as 2015 for Trump anymore. And we now enter this uncharted territory where 12 of his peers have convicted him as a felon. And now there's a question of sentencing versus the Republican National Convention, which is not where you want your independent and moderate voters to be focused as they now start to tune in to a presidential election cycle. So he would have to say something today that really moves beyond the case, because outside of an appeal and all the kind of dry legal maneuvers that we'll see happen behind the scenes, for the average American voter who's going about their lives and maybe paid attention to the headline yesterday, they would need to hear something bigger to be attracted to Trump rather than his admonishment of those who brought the case against him.
So one of the things I guess he's talking about now is the fact that he didn't testify in this case. I will remind our viewers, Katrina, that you're an attorney. The two things that I was thinking about, one, in regards to what Errol was saying about Trump's attorney appearing on television, is one, there seemed to be some reporting, and maybe it was Maggie Haberman, I could be wrong, of the New York Times, who suggested that there was one juror who at occasion most of the jurors would walk in and not look at him and just listen to the evidence and listen to testimony, but there was one that might have made some eye contact or might have seemed sympathetic to the former president, and they had sort of honed in on whoever this individual was, and that is perhaps why, to Errol's point, that Blanche was hoping for either a hung jury or that in one of those instances where you could find not a unanimous decision on one of those counts, that would be the juror that would do that. So the question to you is, did you see that as well? And what do you make of the fact that, rightly or wrongly, Donald Trump did not testify?
I did not see that juror in particular, but I did hear about that there was a juror that would sometimes smile as they went into court and sort of make eye contact with Trump, because I think a lot of the time the jurors really, they were looking at the witness, at the judge. I did notice yesterday during the jury instruction readback, I saw some of the jurors occasionally glancing in what looked like Trump's direction. And I mean, you don't really know what's going on in their heads, but it kind of made me feel like they were just getting one last look at the man they were about to make this really big decision about in that courtroom. In terms of testifying, I think he absolutely made the right decision not to testify from a legal standpoint.
So, Ross, in the control room, did Trump say in his remarks that he wanted to testify or that he was told that he should not testify? Because I guess he was told. He wanted to. So we're told that in the remarks that he's making live right now at Trump Tower that he wanted to testify. If you were his attorney, what would you tell him?
I would counsel him not to testify, but it really is the defendant's choice. If they want to testify, that is 100% up to them. No matter what their attorney says, that's just counsel. You have the right to speak on your own behalf in your criminal trial and to defend yourself. But of course, if Donald Trump got up on that stand, he would have been so vulnerable. The prosecution had given us a list of all of the points they would bring up in trying to impeach his credibility. I mean, his E. Jean Carroll charges and findings, the New York civil fraud trial, the Trump Organization verdict, which happened with the same judge, Judge Juan Merchan, as well. So there were really a lot of points they could bring up that would make Donald Trump not look good in front of this jury, and I don't know how beneficial it would have been for him to speak on his own behalf.
Well, I don't think he's testified in any of his recent civil
He did.
Well, he
legal
kind of
challenges.
did.
He did? I mean, a tape deposition previous, like, did he
well, no,
get on the
civil fraud he
stand
testified.
under oath?
For E.
Oh,
Jean
okay.
Carroll, but that was very limited.
Limited.
Both of
Very
them,
limited.
yeah.
The judge
Remember, there was
said-
those moments where he would,
I know, he was like, I think that's my ex-wife.
Right.
That's the other thing, is when he testified in civil fraud, I mean, he's not good at answering questions directly. And I feel like he kind of got away with it in the civil courtroom. But Judge Juan Merchan is really not someone who's going to put up with that. You know, he would just sort of politicize on the stand. At one point, he was accusatory toward the judge. So, you know, it's not the most composed demeanor for a criminal defendant on the stand.
What about the circus outside the courthouse, Errol, where you were? You were out there every day. I mean, I'm curious because this morning I think I saw on WCBS New York Station 2 that that there were not a lot of people out there today outside of Trump Tower, both for and against Donald Trump. And to the point that we were just making about the fact that when you wake up this morning, okay, you see the verdict yesterday at 4:35 p.m., you see all the headlines, you got it. The former president of the United States, who actually has no real power now, has been convicted as a convicted felon now. But okay, you got to get the kids off to school this morning. You got to, go to work. You got to put food on the table. You got to, find out an effective way to pay for health care and pay for your kids' education. People are moving on with their lives and the things that matter to them. So now that the circus is over, I wonder, because there are not a lot of people apparently outside of Trump Tower, what it was like down there every morning and every day.
Well, for
were people really that passionate, for lack of a better, or were they just there for the fun of it?
I think it was much more the latter than the former. I mean, we, for 6 weeks, noticed that, look, there's a public park next to the courthouse, and there's a main New York road and street in front of it. So there were certainly the people who were coming and going, getting on with their lives, taking care of their own business in the courthouse. Then you had this small kind of flexible contingency of pro-Trump supporters who ranged from 4 people on some days to a few dozen. It was noteworthy when there was quite a coordinated, it seemed, pro-Trump effort on, I would say perhaps last week, when you had, it was just after we saw House Speaker Mike Johnson show up on his behalf and then speak to reporters outside. We also saw a number of, Freedom Caucus Republicans show up the following day. And on that same day, you had a truck. And we didn't show this on air because we didn't want to show too much of the circus. But you had a truck of helium balloons that were strategically rolled in front of the press, in between the courthouse and the press, that was released and opened. And they were, phallic shaped. And they.
Why didn't I know this?
Serious?
And they had
pink.
And they were pink. And they had images of Judge Merchan.
Let's see it now. This is the internet. Let's see it.
And they had images.
You can don't search for it on the work computer, please.
But that was the point. I mean, there was a man with a MAGA hat who got out the truck and said, this is a circus of a trial. It's a sham trial. And they're a bunch of expletives.
Wow.
And that's why we've got these balloons floating around with images of the judge and special counsel Jack Smith printed onto each of the balloons. That was just one of the wild aspects of the scene outside. To the NYPD's credit, traffic kept moving.
Yeah.
Most people were protected. We had that horrific incident as well as the man who set himself on fire in the park, who died the following weekend. That did not appear connected in any way. But the NYPD did successfully keep people there safe, allowed the public access to that park throughout the course of the trial, where you then saw pro and anti-Trump protesters arguing with each other. That was always dealt with. But certainly speaks to the two different audiences for Donald Trump. You had the legal process and those looking at this in a very sober, serious way. And then you have his supporters who will support him no matter what. And I think we're looking at some of the aerials outside of Trump Tower. And you should always kind of look closely because in some cases you've got more press than you have protesters.
Yeah, that's a great
The
point.
fact that there's a crowd while he speaks says one thing, but we'd have to see closer footage to know exactly who's there.
Just to add, too, I was very fascinated by the public that came to this trial because people would wait online for days. At one
Just
point,
to get a seat.
Just to get, at one point, I know there were at least 12 people that came on a Saturday morning for the following Monday. So they literally stayed for days just to try
Like
to
in
get...
a line? Like
They
at
stayed
a
in a
rock
line.
concert?
Apparently they had, I talked to them, it was very fascinating to me because it was almost like its own little microcosm of the trial. And some of them would come all the time. There was a dedicated group. I know at least one was a Trump supporter. She was either first or one of the first few in line every day. I think one was like an Asian tourist who was coming every day to the trial. And apparently they had all these rules they had set up so they could leave for certain amounts of time to go shower and sleep.
Lord.
And it was just a very fascinating thing. The people who want to come witness this.
Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. Let me ask you this, Katrina. One of the criticisms that the former president, his sycophants, and his supporters have made is that in suggesting that this was a political witch hunt, there's no evidence that President Biden or the Department of Justice had absolutely anything to do with this. This is a state trial. But there is evidence that Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor, did talk about his desire to bring Trump into a courtroom. We know that his lawyers plan to appeal this verdict. Is that something that they can hang, one of many things that they can hang the appeal on, which is that this was politically motivated by the New York prosecutor to bring these charges against Trump, that under normal circumstances, these would not be brought up? Is that one of the many things that they are going to be looking at for an appeal?
I think it's absolutely one of the things. But in order to prevail, they have to show that the judge made significant errors during this trial. But I think we're going to see many points of appeal.
So the Alvin Bragg thing doesn't...
So the argument that he was targeted because for political reasons isn't a reason for...
I think that could come into play. I mean, they also claim that the judge is... has made Democratic donations, that his daughter is affiliated with Democratic politics, that the gag order was an unconstitutional restriction on Donald Trump's rights. There's, of course, the Stormy Daniels testimony. They think that that was prejudicial, that she went too far in her details of their sexual encounter. The jury selection process, I think they will bring up as well. I think that, as we've often seen, they kind of throw as much as they can at the wall and see what they can make progress with these charges. So I really think we're going to see a lot of points of appeal come up from
How long would that take, though? We know that the sentencing is in July.
July.
And we've got an election in November. Could we see this case in appeal before the election, or will it be after?
These appeals can take a really long time, but they could decide to expedite it. He can't actually file the appeal until after the sentencing. So they have 30 days after the sentencing. I think they're saying that they're already preparing, so we could see it quite quickly, although we do know that they like to delay everything as much as possible as well. But there are appeals that can take years. There are appeals that can take months, and it really depends how quickly the judges decide to move this through.
One of the things... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to update you all that some of the targets that Trump has spoken about so far include the judge, include Michael Cohen, one of the key witnesses, and he is trying to tell Americans that this is bigger than him and that he's now in this fight for them. So you do now have two kind of divergent tracks.
Right.
On the legal front, you'll have sentencing in July. They're going to appeal. They're going to kick and scream and delay as much as they can. But considering the point we made about him remaining under the gag order, some of what he says here may go outside of those bounds and factor into the judge's sentencing decision. Separately from that, because most Americans won't be watching every twist and turn, this does put pressure on President Biden, who has yet to speak out directly on this decision, this guilty verdict. But it does create political pressure on Democrats to counter the narrative in some way, because Donald Trump, as expected, is making this about his supporters and that they are being targeted by the left. Just yesterday, when the guilty verdict was announced, they were fast with their fundraising emails and tweets and messages.
$34 million in 6 hours, they claim.
And Trump describes himself as a political prisoner. I mean, this is new type of language.
When we were doing our Strat Chat this morning, Joel Payne, who's a Democratic strategist, suggested the same to us, that President Biden should have made a statement, even though yesterday he was mourning and memorializing his son, Beau, but that he at some point should come out and address this. I think if you are the advisors to the President of the United States, you say why. The American judicial system worked the way that it should. Remember, if you all will, I'm old enough to remember that former President Obama made one comment about Skip Gates being arrested by police outside in Boston. Just one comment. And that was blowback for like years, of a president weighing in on something as innocuous as a member of academia being, I don't remember if he was actually arrested or handcuffs were put on him, but whatever the circumstances, Obama talking about something that had to do with police procedure and with the law and not to do with national security or what he's charged as commander-in-chief to do was not a good look for him. And so now we're asking the President of the United States to say something about his political opponent in an election
that
year?
was Joel's opinion in terms of strategizing. But I think in this case, because you have, Donald Trump blaming President Biden for targeting him incorrectly, that it would be. I also agree that I don't see what the upside would be. But I want to ask you, Katrina, about something else. Another thing that we're hearing from the president is this idea that this is a dangerous precedent to set, that future presidents must be protected from this sort of targeting or persecution. Can we just talk a little bit about that? And we're talking about something that happened. So I don't know if he's talking about executive privilege. I don't think he is, because it didn't happen while he was president.
He wasn't president.
But is this somehow out of the ordinary? Is this a dangerous precedent?
This is not a dangerous precedent to set. I mean, he's made this argument often in relation to his immunity appeal in D.C., of course, and that's related to his election interference case that Jack Smith brought. And, Donald Trump has often said this has never happened before to any president, as though he's being isolated. But Jack Smith has said, well, that's because no president has ever taken actions like this. And it's very important that everyone be held criminally accountable for their actions. And in that courtroom, Donald Trump was like any other criminal defendant. He had to sit there every day in this dingy courtroom in Manhattan for weeks and be subjected to this trial, to hearing about these stories that I'm sure he didn't want to sit through, told by Stormy Daniels, told by Michael Cohen. And he had to be judged by a jury of his peers, of New Yorkers. And that is just how every defendant should be treated.
So I have another question, because what I have heard critics say was that this was selective prosecution, that this happens all the time, and plenty of people skate on a charge like this.
Well, that's his claim, right? That he's being targeted unfairly.
These charges are prosecuted all of the time. They've said it's the bread and butter of their office. So this is not a unique charge. And even this elevation of the falsification of business records charge from a misdemeanor to a felony is not unique either. The part that is a bit novel is the fact that they've looped in this New York election law, whereas this is a federal election. So there is some debate. It's never been tested on appeal whether or not a New York election law can be applied to a federal presidential election.
Well, so we are on the cusp of, I believe in August of this year, it will be 50 years since President Richard Nixon resigned the office of the presidency. And I was speaking with John Dickerson earlier this morning, the anchor of the Daily Report on CBS News streaming. And I just asked him to give us the context of how far we have come from that moment in time in American history to this one, where at that moment when Richard Nixon was faced with the evidence of corruption, he was told by members of his own party that if he were to be impeached in the United States Senate, he would probably only get about 5 votes. You need 2/3 to convict somebody. He would only get 5 votes. And the person who delivered that was Barry Goldwater, who was then a very hard right conservative Republican member who delivered that news to President Nixon and said that I'm not one of those 5 who would support you in this impeachment. I understand when people say to me that Republican Party is not this Republican Party, but the notion that even Richard Nixon understood that he was not above the law. It doesn't strike me that when former President Trump makes the statements that he is making, calling it a rigged trial, saying we had a DA who was a failed DA, crime is rampant in New York, as if that has anything to do with his trial, other than perhaps to suggest that he should be focusing on crime as opposed to trying him in this case. You pointed out, Katrina, that in that courtroom he was treated like anybody else, and there's dozens of guys and women on Rikers who are all saying the same thing. This is a rigged system. I'm innocent.
Yeah. I mean, and the Nixon example is perfect because that is also when Nixon, when he left office, was pardoned by Ford. And that's been used as an example to show that he felt that he did have criminal liability. He needed that pardon because otherwise he could have been criminally prosecuted.
And there was a study done from 10,000 similar cases in New York, same charges. This was done by attorney Norm Eisen, and he found that falsifying business records in New York has resulted in prison sentences even for 10% of the 10,000 cases that he reviewed. So while Trump may say this is unprecedented, you know, I've been targeted, the facts don't support that. Now, again, to your question of, well, should Biden respond? There's a political debate there. We are in a different time in 2024 than during the Obama presidency, where all previous norms no longer exist. We now have a convicted felon running for president and a base that still is lockstep behind him. The Trump campaign announcing last night, and Trump repeating now in this speech, that they raised somewhere around $35 million after the guilty verdict. And we have to remember that for some folks, for many people, they're going to digest all of this news in their own echo chamber. One of the things I've noticed from covering this trial and filing reports on television, on streaming, and online is that when you post a story online about the Trump trial, it will get high engagement because there's effectively a fight happening in the comments between pro-Trump supporters and those arguing with them, this kind of visceral tension among people who are in two completely different worlds. Meanwhile, we all live in the same world. So I do think his rhetoric today, the things that his surrogates are saying about Project 2025, which speaks to Trump wanting to take revenge if he wins the White House on any opponents or people who spoke out against him, now carry a higher level of seriousness because he's not budging or changing.
Katrina, 10% saw jail time. What do the rest of them get? What's the typical sentence then?
You know, I'd have to look at Norm's study for that. Yeah. But the other sentences are, there's probation, there's monetary fines, there's conditional discharge, there is community service, there's house arrest, which I think would probably be more unusual for the normal defendant. But I mean, there are cases where the defendant could have been handcuffed and taken to prison right away. Obviously, that didn't happen with Donald Trump. He was released. He will have a sentencing in July. But as Errol said, that study is very interesting because 90% of people did not get jail time, but 10% did. So it would not be unprecedented for someone in Trump's position with these charges to receive a jail sentence. Whether he will or not, we don't know. It seems unlikely, but it's absolutely possible, and it's happened before, including 2 different charges. But Alan Weisselberg was charged for a white-collar crime by Judge Merchan in that very court.
And it is still up to that same judge to determine what his sentence will be based on his conduct in the court, based on his character, based on any remarks he said post-verdict. So Trump does hold his own fate in his own hands as he blames others, specifically those on the left, for targeting him.
And also the judge, who's going to be determining what his sentence is like. By the way, will he be able to vote in November?
This is a question people are trying to figure out because there's Florida rules, but some of them point to New York rules. I think a big part of it depends on whether he's been put in prison or not, which seems unlikely. So my understanding is that if he is not yet serving a prison sentence, there's New York rules that will apply where he will still be able to vote in Florida.
Well, you know,
but it's a little complicated.
It's kind of weird that you have a system in this country where there are only perhaps 2 states where I believe that convicted felons can actually vote, and in the rest of the country, if you are convicted of a crime, you're not unable to vote.
If you're currently serving your prison sentence, you can't vote.
And here we have a president, an individual who can actually run for the presidency. Could he pardon himself?
Not for the state crimes.
Not
no.
for the
So
state crimes. So for
he can-
all the other ones, Georgia, January 6th.
Not Georgia. So Georgia and New York are
Okay.
both state charges. So Trump cannot pardon himself. With the D.C. and Florida cases, he could be pardoned, or he could have the DOJ, dismiss these charges. So he has more power for federal charges, and he really doesn't have any control over the state charges.
Let me ask you a quick question, because Donald Trump is talking. We're not taking it unless he sort of makes news, but we're getting sort of notes. We're aware of what he's taking, what he's saying. And one of the things that he brought up in his remarks here is about Alan Weisselberg, who did not testify. Now, if Alan Weisselberg did testify, I don't know if that would have worked in his favor, right? But he did not testify because he made a deal. Donald Trump is saying they didn't want him to testify, and that's why they put him in jail. That's not what happened, Trina.
That is not what happened. They absolutely wanted Weisselberg to be a cooperating witness, but the reason he's in jail is because he committed perjury. He committed perjury on the stand. He lied under oath, and he did come up. He was a bit of a gaping hole in this trial because he was such a key player in a lot of the important moments related to this case. So I think there was a feeling of, where is Alan Weisselberg in this courtroom? But it's also very clear why neither side wanted him. The prosecution could have technically brought him in, but Weisselberg also has a deal when he left the Trump organization to not cooperate with prosecutors. They're paying him, I believe it's $2 million. I think it's still being paid out. And obviously he's been known to lie on the stand, so they don't know if they brought him in, if he would take the fifth, or if he would just perhaps not tell the truth on the stand.
Right.
And clearly Trump's team also chose not to put him on the stand.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And to remind people about just sort of who he is, who he was for the Trump organization, and why he would have been a key witness.
So, yeah, he was the chief financial officer, and the role that he played is he was part of, in particular, one key meeting where there's actually a very important exhibit from this meeting.
Yeah.
It's a First Republic bank statement. It shows the wire transfer that Michael Cohen made to Keith Davidson, who was Stormy Daniels' attorney at the time. That's the $130,000 he was ultimately reimbursed for. That's the foundation of these falsification of business records charges. And you see Alan Weisselberg's handwriting on this paper, and it's doing a calculation. It shows $130,000 for Stormy Daniels, $50,000 that was paying back a tech company that had rigged a poll for Trump that Michael Cohen had covered. And then there was a $60,000 bonus for Cohen. And in there was some doubling up to account for taxes.
Right.
So Weisselberg was really part of a crucial moment, and was important evidence in this case for this jury. That exhibit is one of the most important exhibits that there was.
That's good. Well, yeah, he's continuing to talk. Once again, just to remind people, the reason that we're not taking the president is because he's actually not saying anything that is making news right now. He's pretty much saying a lot of what he said each day as he walked in and out of the courthouse, which is to complain about the trial, to complain about the judge, attacking witnesses, which I think he's not supposed to do because the gag order remains in place. So we'll see what sort of impact that could have on him moving forward when it comes to sentencing. We talked a little bit earlier about sentencing, and judges don't just sort of make sentences up. Okay, we're just going to see if the president... Okay, he's left the podium. It doesn't look like he's taking any questions. Looks like... right, no questions. Okay, so just his sort of statement about the case. But what I wanted to get from you, Katrina, was that there are guidelines. You don't just sort of, as a judge, have a feeling about someone. And they have to sort of take certain things into account, disregard certain things. And yes, there's some art to it, but there's also responsibility on the judge's part.
Absolutely. There are set guidelines for these charges. So for every one of these counts, he could give him up to 4 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. And for someone like Trump, so technically you could add all of those up, but really for this type of non-violent offender, first-time offender, also an older offender, if he got any prison time, they would likely be run concurrently. He'd probably actually give him less than a year, even if that is even on the table.
Yeah.
But he can take a lot of factors into account. And leading up to that sentencing, there will be filings from each side. There will be an interview. A probation report is going to be produced. So There may be an interview with a psychologist or a social worker where Trump can talk about why he thinks he should get a lesser sentence. I mean, one thing I was thinking about when we were talking before, too, is I remember in the civil fraud trial, the judge talked about how he just didn't show any contrition. And we're seeing that again in his statements that he continues to make even after this case. And those things are all factors, as well as his behavior, his gag order violations. You know, he almost ended up in jail during this trial just based on his own rhetoric. So all of these things can come into play.
All right.
Yeah.
This was a really interesting, fascinating discussion because it's kind of, and we've been using this word a lot lately, unprecedented, historic. It's sort of become a cliche because if everything that Trump does is unprecedented and historic, then nothing is. But really, I've known you, Errol, for a very long time. You've never covered anything like this. Katrina, you as a lawyer, you probably never imagined. In my discussions with John Dickerson, we talked about the framers and how they, when they were thinking about forming and framing this country, they never anticipated a moment like this, even though they tried to protect against it. Thank you both for spending some time with us. Katrina and Errol, we appreciate it. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back on the other side of that break. Stick around.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I use sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good. Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS reports
That Desired Farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight,
Collective ownership is powerful.
to keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I